Push the button, Frank.
We're
Are we
live.
live? We're live. Cool. All right. So this isn't a dream. Oh, man. Well, welcome to Tuesday evening, the mighty Trampled Underfoot podcast on the also mighty YouTubes, Spreaker. Everywhere you are, we are. You just don't know it. So last week, and this happens quite a bit, especially when I go back and listen to an episode. Last week, we were discussing Paul Simon's Graceland, and it was a music-based episode. But you said a couple of things in there that got me thinking along other lines, but I didn't want to derail the conversation. So you had mentioned that you were kind of a fan of the Old West and the American Old West. And I didn't get to pursue it, as I said, but I wanted to see, did you mean that in the context of, it's when we were talking about Willie Nelson's guitar. Did you, and you were talking about the Red-Headed Stranger, the album. Did you mean that just in terms of media, like Western TV shows and Western movies? Or was that something, along a cultural sense in like the cowboys and the white hat versus the black hat and the migrations of people and what have you? I never really got to pursue that. So
I like all aspects of that, from the media side of it, like TV, movies. My grandfather used to buy these novellas, these pocket, and I don't even know where they got the notion to. I guess bookstores or off the rack or what. And he'd carry around these Western, and then the covers of them. You'd see a guy with a rifle, bent, like laying across the rock out in the desert, and a wagon, and then a lady in distress with those old dresses and painted, that style of cartoony, sort of like novella booklet sort of. And he was totally always into that stuff, and maybe it came from there. But also my mom had posters of like the Marlboro. First things I'd open my eyes to, I'd see the Marlboro, I'd see the Marlboro, and all these themes that she'd do for my room when I was a little kid. And so I don't know. There's a warm place in my heart for it, maybe because of childhood, and plus the movies and growing up. And I just, as an adult, and it's always been, but the theme of people, the theme of America, number one, and what that means.
Okay.
Right. And what it means to me, which the important part of America to me, or the United States, the important part to me personally is, I guess one of the parts is the ideology of the individual. We can do it, and then let's get on a wagon or whatever, and let's travel and find a better life. That idea, and mind you, it's not like it's been my adventure, because I've always been here in Sweetwater, but the idea of the family, and then, an area unknown, the adventure of it, it's kind of romanticized. But
Oh yeah. It's highly romanticized for sure. So you kind of hit me with something else just there. You were talking about the novels, the novellas or the novels of the day. Are you talking like Louis L'Amour, Zane Grey, books of that nature?
If you had to ask me, what you did, I would have to tell you that this was my grandfather reading through them, and I'd look at the covers, but I was not. I saw that in his sort of day-to-day, but I didn't pick them up and read them myself.
Okay, because you're talking to a guy who's married to a woman who owns everything Louis L'Amour ever published. She is a massive Louis L'Amour Old West fan. And I have to say, I wasn't super into the Westerns much. I mean, they were always there growing up. Westerns were on television and Westerns were in the movies until the mid 70s. But I mean, growing up as a kid, the TV Western, oh my God, I would say out of 10 TV shows, the top 10 TV shows, probably 7 of them were Westerns because they were all over the place. You
Yeah.
couldn't escape it. But it was supposed to be kind of action packed to keep the kids' attention, but it was always almost soap opera ish. I mean, shows like Wagon Train and Gunsmoke and Bonanza and what have you, they were almost soap opera ish. They were the evening dramas on TV. And I went to see a few of the Western movies, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and My Name is Nobody and some of the Clint Eastwood spaghetti Westerns. But I never really could identify with quote unquote the Old West because I live out West. And most of these things were written by people who were from back east and still thought of the Western United States as the Old West. I mean, and we're sitting here. Yeah, I lived in the desert. And yeah, I lived way out in the brush and stuff. And it was common to see, horses and I'm talking wild horses walking through our yard to go from point A to point B.
Hmm.
But I never could identify it, and I really didn't get interested in it all that much until I married Linda and actually started reading some of these old Western stories from Louis L'Amour. And there's some good stuff in there. If you're a reader, you can't go wrong with a Louis L'Amour book. You really can't. But the way you describe those novels, I'm willing to bet you they were some of Louis L'Amour's books.
I mean,
and I became further interested in it listening to stories from my dad and my grandfather, because it turns out I'm descendant from people who actually did that. They came out on the wagon trains in the 1860s.
Which is amazing.
Yeah. And you're right, we heavily romanticized it. In that they were actually just looking for a better life. They wanted a better way. Some people escaped. They ran away from situations they had created, or they ran away from the law. Some folks just tried to make a better living. Some folks thought they came out because you could basically settle larger areas of land for cheaper than you could back, quote unquote, in the States. There were a multitude of reasons, but it was all about independence because you had to rely on yourself. Comedian Gallagher once told the joke that if you were working your way across the country in your wagon and it broke down and you were too dumb or too lazy to fix it, that's just where you stayed. He said, well, think about it. You don't think people headed out for Tulsa on purpose, do you? So there was a bit of that independence there, but it was also forced because there was no backup. You were completely self-reliant. And if you couldn't do it, you were just kind of in trouble.
I mean, the idea of, the whole thing is the discovery of the new world and people leaving the old world that might not have had the best sort of set of circumstances on one hand and said, let's try our luck in a new world. And then some people, because they had to, because they were sent there, or some other people on religious, grounds in order to spread the gospel, and others then again military. They just simply were part of a military and they had to go and explore, and all these descendants of all these people populated what we have now here. And it's a really interesting and strange thing how humanity customs have come to the Americas, and then kind of like a blender, stuffed all these pieces in, pressed, liquefy, and you have this batter of all sorts of crazy, and yet you could still, if you look hard enough, you could identify the past and where things come from. People did write and document and all this, but when you're born, wherever it is that you're born, um, and your eyes open for the first time, and you or experience taking things in. If your folks, like I mentioned, they plaster your walls with like, Marlboro Man
Mm-hmm.
and all these things, and there's something that, well, these images are in your brain, but also growing up in the 80s watching the movies, Hollywood, the way, and we've talked about this,
Mm-hmm.
they also like, you know like stepped on the gas on that and ramped it up some.
Mm-hmm.
Even it doesn't have to even be officially Old West, but the spirit of the adventure, like Romancing the Stone,
Mm-hmm.
or I don't know, Indiana Jones for that
Yeah.
matter. It's kind of that iconic figure of the person jotting out in
Mm-hmm.
order to gold rush, in order to seek fortune and stuff. And I bought that hook, line, and sinker, that theme, and I internalized it, and it's just it gives me it's like it gives me warm. It's like, when you get sick, and when you were a kid and you'd watch like whatever, you'd stay home, and it's like comfort food for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I feel about it.
Okay. But this is the outdoor adventure, and the Western kind of encapsulated that, or because like you mentioned, Romancing the Stone, which was supposedly set in modern times, but
Yeah.
then out in the jungles of Colombia. But then you mentioned, what was the other one you mentioned? Indiana Jones, which took
Yeah.
place in the 30s. So it was kind of removed from the Old West, but that it was still the action adventure. So it's more the outdoor action adventure than it is the 1800s with its technology and what have you.
Yeah, well, I'm saying that 1800s spirit,
Mm-hmm.
or actually that what you call western bound,
Mm-hmm.
across the sea spirit,
Mm-hmm.
has continued in all those themes, like
Yeah.
Indiana Jones, and like that spirit of like, we're gonna,
Discovery.
yeah, that discovery.
Okay.
And I don't know that there's much more left to vast, empty, areas to venture into and say, I shall stake my claim here. I don't know
Yeah,
that is so.
I don't. Well, it would have to be small islands out in the oceans or what have you. But there are, areas. There are still areas of South America that have yet to be explored.
That is true.
You know,
Africa,
'cause,
there's places in Africa that are
yeah,
unknown.
right, exactly. Most of Antarctica remains unexplored, but
But
that's
then
because of
again,
physical limitations. You
yeah,
just can't really get into it. And it's odd to me. I don't know. It's kind of fun, but it's kind of odd that you took this outdoor, independent, adventurous spirit. You must have internalized it a little bit because you're basically still live where you grew up. Did you do much exploring and adventuring of your own to go see new things and
no, I've done a little bit of
a
that,
little bit? Okay.
but it's all it's because I'm more like the imagination and the
Mm-hmm.
cerebral and thought and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Not that it's anything out of this world, but I'm more inclined to that.
Mm-hmm.
You
Okay.
know, I'm more
Okay.
inclined to imagination and whatnot,
Okay.
and history
Okay.
and all that, and so it's a natural. But yeah, the Old West,
Okay.
and a funny thing about the Old West, which is what we were talking about before, is that in America we do not see a significant amount of. There's a part of that history of the Old West that we don't. I really, being from the East, never
Mm-hmm.
even contemplated, to be honest with you. Um, a lot of people in the Old West, going back into the 1500s, this is prior to Jamestown and all this,
Right.
the Spanish were exploring
Yep.
the Americas.
Yeah.
In my particular, with my history going back, apparently, um, I don't have that old of a migration into the New World. I have an 1800s migration into the New World.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not, but in the Old West, a lot of those people, a lot of those cowboys, a lot of those,
Mm-hmm.
they were ancestrally Spanish. They
Yeah.
were from Spain.
Paniolos.
But this is not what we see. This is not what we see in the broader, sort of popular
Right.
culture. What we see is the typical that we know of,
Uh-huh.
the maybe the Mexican gangster or group, and then we have the Anglo, protagonist and whatnot.
Mhm.
But and again, that's more, I guess, romanticizing, within the concept of what. But it's not. More accurate would be that you had people here 100 years prior
Mhm.
living in those territories: Colorado,
Uh-huh.
New Mexico, Arizona, California,
Yep.
Louisiana, for that matter, all the
Yep.
way, all covering the West Coast. And then you had a mixing of people and cultures, and it was barren anyhow. Like it was,
Yeah.
and that's more, but it's never portrayed as such.
It was a sanitized version of the Old West where it was all white people. That's the way the media of the day portrayed it. And it was in the movies, it was on radio, it was in the television when it finally came out. And that was one of the reasons for the downfall of the Western in popular culture, because it wasn't real. And it's funny we get into this because you know how I get into these YouTube rabbit holes. And here's a link I'm going to have to put up on the Trampled Underfoot Facebook page. Go over to Facebook, search for Trampled Underfoot Podcast. You'll find us there. I'll put a link to this video. It just appeared in my suggested one day, and it was called, and I don't remember who did it, but I'll go back to my history and I'll find it. It was called You Couldn't Make Blazing Saddles Today. And the guy in the video subtitled it, Why Would You Want to? And it was basically, the guy discusses this very concept, and I'm in 100% agreement with him. It was decades of building up that sanitized image of how things were in the Old West. And there were certain subjects that were taboo. You had the white hat for the good guy and the black hat for the bad guy because it made it easier to follow them across a little screen that you couldn't see.
Yeah.
And it was nothing but white folks. A wholesome, family-oriented attitude where nobody swore. All of the women were dressed prim and proper. All of the men were do-gooders except for a few bad eggs just to remind us that evil was still out there. And then one movie came along and just exploded the entire thing and drove the final nail in the coffin of the Western, and that was Blazing Saddles. Because it not only brought up those things and mentioned them, it put them on full display, and they headlined the entire movie. And after that, there wasn't a Western that could be seen as real if it didn't bring up all of those things that the TV and movie Westerns wouldn't touch before that.
And yet, as time goes on, like we've seen awesome Westerns resurface,
Right.
but they're more grittier. I guess it's the change of the
Exactly.
times.
It's the changing of the times, and it's the changing of the sensibilities, and the trail has already been blazed. And once you go to a certain point, you can't really go back, because no Western would have been taken seriously if it was all white folks. No Western could be taken seriously if nobody swore, or if nobody was walking down the street and spit on the sidewalk, or if there wasn't the violence that was back in those days, and just the harsh realities of life.
Now, why is it? Now, I'm curious because you mentioned, and I'll throw this out. What is the difference between white folks, and I'm curious about this, and Spanish folks?
Well,
Because
if you're talking about a historic context,
well, I'm talking about, so the mention. So here's the interesting, because this is one of those things that is always kind of shrouded in, what is a white person in the context of what we're talking about historically, and people that came to the Americas from Spain and populated, like what
What,
Why is one white and the other one not? In the context of that, why? Or
what,
how is it that that's so?
because at the time, the U.S. and Spain were historically not on good terms. We're talking in the 1800s. We weren't really on good terms. We'd fought a couple of wars. Um,
No, we're talking not 1800s.
oh, okay.
When this originated, we're talking 1500s,
Okay. Well, then, yeah, then the
and then the move.
British, yeah, the British and the French were enemies. The British, the French, and the Spanish were all enemies with one another. Everybody was trying to one up the other and be the richest in the biggest empire. So you had the British Empire, the French Empire, then the Portuguese and the Dutch got involved as well. And it was just looking for control of the resources. It was out there for the fortune. And it was colonization and pillaging basically. It was, we need to go pillaging some stuff. It started with the Portuguese, who basically kind of had the monopoly on the spice trade. And
The but you see what I mean about
yeah.
the situation with. See, what I'm getting at is this. Although I understand it, what
Mhm.
what people mean when they usually say that, and it's more based on an Anglo-Saxon island sort of scenario, and then a Northern European thing. But it's I think you're right that it has to do with us versus them, and therefore let's categorize because we're a separation away.
Right.
But um, but it's is it real? I mean, is it a real thing? Is it something? Because the old, and we saw it in movies, like you mentioned with Blazing Saddles, breaking that. But it is a cultural sort of norm without any basis, or is there basis to it?
Well, you gotta remember what went on, and this happened for hundreds of years. Well, in this context, for a few hundred years. Um, the British were at war with the French constantly. They were at war. They were in competition with Spain constantly. At sea, they were at war with Spain because there were privateers that were just this side of pirates.
Yeah,
Privateers were basically state-sponsored pirates.
and the Buccaneers as well.
Exactly. And they would go out and try to not only try to figure out how, say, the Spanish were getting all of this gold and all of these spices, but where they were getting it from. So while out on the sea, they would try to seize it and take it back for king and country. Diplomatically, they weren't really at war with one another, but there was still a lot of that competition going on in between. Like I said, England and France were constantly at war with one another. And so with the English, and I'm going to, in this context, include the Scottish and the Irish, because at that time it was all the British Isles. With them thinking they were superior to the French, and both of them thinking they were superior to the Spanish, and the French thinking they were superior to the English and the Spanish believing they were superior to everybody else. I mean, everybody thought that they were the boss and number one. So history is always taught by the victor. So history here was taught by the descendants of those people who won here in the US. History in Spain was taught by the people who won there in Spain. History in Portugal was taught by the people who won in Portugal. Nobody really ever wanted to admit that somebody got the better of them. So certain things get left out. And so folks here being taught a certain way by the white people who won were taught by the people who won to think like the people who won. So now here we are in 2020 trying to apply a more broadened and more enlightened 21st century mentality to things that were happening in the 15, 16, 1700s when we have no idea of the context in which those things were going on. You know what I mean? Does that make sense at all?
It makes sense to me, and I think you're right about that. I will say this. So my cousin uh, is lives in Spain and was born in Spain, and they're part of the family that never left Spain.
Okay.
But my grandfather did leave Spain, and he moved to Cuba. And well, she's always lived there, and I have family over there. And this is a European country, and they have their history. And well, she mentioned to me one time in conversation, these are people that have never necessarily come here, so they're in their world.
Sure.
And she mentioned that her daughter on some sort of a school, like where they trade people, students, and one
Exchange
goes
students. Yeah.
exchange students and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And and her daughter went to New York to study for a summer or for whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And the one other girl from New York went to Spain. And by the way, she enjoyed, we've talked for hours and stuff. And the girl that went from New York to Spain, she was, oh my goodness, it's just a totally different world.
Yeah.
But her daughter, my cousin's daughter, my cousin as well, when she returned, she said, I kept running into people and they would ask me, where I was from. And I'd say I'm from Spain, so and so, and they'd say to me, "Oh, that's in Mexico." Back to back, nobody had an idea. And she said to them at the end, she told her mom, she says, she said, next to France, she said, next to Paris, she said, and then people, oh, Paris, and then they kind of had, but my cousin commented they probably don't know where even Paris is. Now, I guess the moral of the story from my vantage point is, and from their vantage point too, you have to understand that there's a historical gap, ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
You can't expect people, like for instance me, I live in Miami, and I don't like travel all over the place, but I am so curious, and I'm not saying that I'm the most curious, but I'm curious enough that I'll end up, especially with the internet now, easy access, I'll end up reading about the Netherlands or some, person in Russia that lives in the mountains and a radioactive thing fell and their village, it's just a few people, they never left the area since the Cold War, or something in Japan, or like I am curious to whatever I'm curious about. Sure. I'm curious about, but history is one of those things, and like you said, to apply the victors and whatnot, history is one of those things that I don't know necessarily how popular for the broad majority of people it is. So in the context of different ethnicities and all that, it's a tough thing, and that's why you get the Old West, as we saw. But the Blazing Saddles blew open those doors, and I think that another thing is that there's a whole history that's not been told about the Old West, which I'm actually starting to learn about since I've been reading. I had no idea, really. I just thought it was like these drunkards in Mexico that they just, they were sitting by a barrel and stuff. And I'm like, well, okay, but that's not the case.
Nope.
You had them in society of Spanish descent, also mixing with the native people, even native, like, people from tribe from the north, just all sorts of crazy stuff. But it never was, because I was more of a fan looking through the
right.
So for a person like me, that their parents were born in Cuba, but their parents, come from, we've done together the ancestry thing. I have a different story than that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that's better or worse or sideways or this or that, but it's my personal story is my story because it just happens to be that.
It's also more personal for you because you are one generation from the migration. It was your parents that came here. And the closer you are to that migration, the more personal it is. My ancestors came here in the late 1600s or early 1700s before it was a nation. So I'm so far away from the immigration, I don't even know why they came here. We're not even 100% sure who it was that came here because of, various and sundry things. I mean, they either didn't keep records or the records have been destroyed or something of that effect. So it's more personal to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing, personally.
Well, there's also a strange. So here's the thing, though. So I don't have a history, myself, let's say, of being here beyond my lifetime.
Well, neither do I, but
none of us do. But if I start to unravel my story of the past of my parents and this and that, it goes into the things that we've talked about, which is very complex, and revolutions and military actions and being kicked out of home, just all these things that we've. But people of my ilk, let's say, that traveled from the old world to the Americas did so hundreds of years, 500 years before my grandfather decided to leave because he didn't want to be a priest in Spain. And those people ended up in Mexico or Bogota or Argentina or New Mexico territory and this and that. And there's people out there, because we talked about this in the beginning, with descendants of those people that have also lost the notion of what the heck even it all started with. But I was reading in some forums where they read through, or I read through, and people argue back and forth because the issue of categorizing a person into a group that they don't belong to is going to get some backlash. Simply put, you can't categorize, a person without getting pushback. A person from that, I guess, southwestern region, they were commenting there and said, listen, like they were, one guy said, yeah, because, the Indians from Mexico and this and that. And the guy said, no, hold on. I've been in Colorado since, like, he said, like 1600. I don't know what the heck he said, 1700s. And since this was territory, my family has been, and it is true that here we mixed with the Indian native populations and whatnot. Sure. But I do not consider myself of the Mexican,
Again, we're trying to apply a 21st century mentality to things that happened years and years and years ago.
Well, people try to put because it's the easiest. It's easier for the great majority of people to say, okay, here you go, Mexico. It's easier for everybody. It's easy. Okay, Mexico.
Well, it has been for centuries, but yeah.
Right. But it's not the, it's not the Louisiana Purchase was actually purchased. Spain had control of Louisiana. They had control. So did the French, but Spain had. Once that was, the country continued to expand, and it became, but the theme of it is that there's individuals that have more complicated stories. And I agree with what you said in the beginning. It just, I guess, what would be the word? A tidying up into a neat box of what the history is. Because people, I don't think that they're interested in a lot of people are not interested in the history of, specifics.
But history is always written by the people who won. It's always written by the victors, and always from the aspect of a superiority. We were at war with Spain off and on good terms off and on, and in competition constantly ever since the first white folks appeared on this continent. I mean, the first settlements on this continent were Spanish settlements. And I'm not talking about temporary. I know about the Norse up in Canada and possibly in the far northeastern U.S. I know about that, but they didn't stay. They did come here, but they left, and that was supposedly in the 1100s. Some people will argue the 1200s, but the first settlements. I mean, the oldest city in the U.S. is St. Augustine, Florida, and that was from the 1500s, and it was settled by Spain.
Yeah, I did visit it once with my folks.
Right. And it's a lot of serious. There was a lot of serious competition. Also, don't forget that we were at war with Mexico in the 1800s. And then there was the whole Republic of Texas thing. And every side wrote that history from a position of strength and superiority over their foe. So that antagonism still happens nowadays. You know, it's less institutionalized, but it's not gone. Folks always still feel a little bit of superiority over the other folks, no matter who they may be.
Yeah, it's part of human. I think it's part. I don't know that it's a good part of it, but it's part of human nature.
It's not a good part, but it's a part of human nature that's been taught to us for so many centuries. It's becoming less and less palatable and less okay, and hopefully all that crap will go away, because I'm with you in that so much of what really happened in history has been lost because we've sanitized it to the point to where it doesn't even sound real. You know, it doesn't even sound feasible, let alone possible. So I don't know, man. It just, to me, I this whole notion that one people can be better than another people has to be perpetuated to be perceived by the public at large. While there are cultural differences, and we all know it, there are regional differences, and we all know it. And those, I don't think, should ever go away. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with embracing your inner Brit or embracing your inner Spaniard.
Or your outer Brit.
But it doesn't have to be a contest or a competition or a source of derision or a source of just violence or arguing or fighting or anything like that. I mean, you know, sometimes it's just, I don't know. I just keep it in my brain. Sometimes there just is no best. There's different, but there's no one better than the other. So, you know, can we just get on with life? You know?
Well, there are. So I don't know how to categorize it, but there are differences that are better. And I don't know how to categorize it, but for instance, I would make the argument that on a, I guess, I don't want to say philosophical, but what would be the word? On a legalistic level, cultural legalistic, or the decisions made by the United States, the founders, you know, the forefathers, the decisions made and what to apply and what not to apply to steer the ship, as it were, of the country. I think that for me was a better way because of, although one could argue the opposite, like nowadays with the results of the craziness, but was a better way because it ensured, in my opinion, the greatest amount of freedom for the greatest amount of people from the basis of the individual.
Yeah.
Recognizing that there's no kings above you, that you are an individual, and that so the concepts that started off this thing, whereas you see a lot of issues throughout the rest of the Americas and a lot of chicanery.
Yeah.
Where the public at large does have issues and suffers, and there's violent, overthrows and cartels and all these things that we see, because people want to make a buck. I get it. People want, but there's a more stable situation here,
Yeah.
and I give that credit
Mhm.
to the founders, because they could have easily turned around and said, "Hey, let's put a
Well,
crown on Washington," and Washington said, which they wanted to do, and
yes,
Washington
they
was,
did.
and so it's like on that kind of level, and it's a complicated subject, just like
Oh,
the Old West.
it's very complicated, but it sticks with that Old West theme in that when you left the states and you were out in the territories, even before there were territories, people talk about lawless towns. It was a lawless continent. There was no law. You were there, and there was nobody to back you up. There was no protection. You protected yourself. If somebody wanted to take your stuff, he who had the biggest weapon won. But you were talking about the way the forefathers set this up. And America is a unique experiment in that, think about the transfer of power here. There are still a lot of nations on this earth where power is only transferred as a result of a military coup. But every 4 to 8 years, we have a peaceful transfer of power where the outgoing leadership stands on a dais with the incoming leadership, and they may hate one another's guts,
and do.
but there's a handshake, and the outgoing says thank you and rides off into the sunset, and the incoming comes in and says, okay, it's my turn. And then in 4 to 8 years, it's done again.
And this is in the context,
Okay.
in one way to look at it,
Mhm.
and this is also in the context you're talking about, like, for Europeans that might hear this in the, and it's not going to be a convincing thing, because it's such an unending sort of story and categories of levels of complex.
Mhm.
But in the context of the New World, where you do have that as the common theme of the only way you gain the control of an area, country, or whatnot is by overthrowing the previous.
Mhm.
That's the norm. So it's in the context of not even the old guard, the old ways of Europe. This is a lot of people multiplying in a new area, and yet being able to function as they have all this time. It's an incredible. So, even from Europe, a lot of people you see on the internet a lot
Yeah.
of criticisms.
Oh, sure. There's always going to be.
And it's a human nature thing, but
Sure.
it's not as crystal clear, black and white. It's a complex thing, history.
Mhm.
Yeah. So yeah.
You also have to look at who populated this continent. I mean, for years and years and years, the overwhelming majority of folks who were not of Spanish descent, who came here as explorers and started settling, the overwhelming majority of folks in what became the United States were here against their will. They were transported as prisoners. They were transported as slaves. They were here against their will. Some of them were members of Her Majesty's service that deserted. They were not here because they wanted to be. Now, granted, there were quite a few who were,
Oh yeah.
but the overwhelming majority were not. So when the flag came up, as we used to say in the Army, when the flag comes up and the ball drops or the balloon goes up and there was fighting to be done, you betcha they wanted their independence, because by getting their independence, it was a up yours to the people who either sent them here or turned their back on them in one way or another.
See, there's a conundrum. There's a conundrum there, and how can I lay this out? So the actual act. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he has his crazy ideas and this and that. But just because someone has crazy ideas doesn't mean that they have sane ideas, or a sane in one aspect. They could be very clear and whatnot. And he mentioned to me, because I'm very of course, partial and to the founding fathers, but there's
Mhm.
but that friend of mine um, isn't so, sort
Mhm.
of solid on the ground. Like, hey, this. He
Uh-huh.
says basically that they acted like petulant children, and when talking about the founding fathers, and they didn't want to pay, which actually, you know, the service, England's service was to protect them, and which they did, and they were trying to recoup so they could continue, and these Americans here, and we're talking about the founding fathers,
Mhm.
because eventually they had a temper tantrum, and basically what they did was commit a form of, treason. He said,
Yeah.
I can't even say, I can't. I was going to start with a form of treason because I can't even, you know, and when I heard that, in my mind, I didn't say it.
Mhm.
I thought, yeah, so what?
Yeah.
which
Mhm.
which by me saying that, it implicates me, my thinking, my schooling, it implicates and it stations me,
Mhm.
because even though he made a point, I said, you know what? Well, screw it.
Yeah.
And that is also part of this that we call America,
Mhm.
and American, and the spirit. But there's a danger looming, festering. I don't want to call it danger, but there's a um, rebellious,
Mhm.
sort of like that you said, that, you know thumb your, you
Yeah.
know
Appears to the yeah.
but even though I'm in agreement with it 100%, at the same time, can we not acknowledge that, well, yeah, that's exactly what it was. How dare we decide on such a course, and yet they did. It was pretty darn bold, and see, that's the
And they
spirit
knew it.
that we're talking about.
And they knew it. Yes, it was treason against the crown. It
Mhm.
was meant to be. It was supposed to be. That was kind of the point.
Well, yeah. Well, but 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 with but so so in saying that, um where does it stop? You have, okay, we did that, but now amongst us,
Mhm.
this will not be the case. You understand?
Well,
Like,
it's we've got 200 years of history, you know. We have removed ourselves from that immigration. We're a few generations away from it, you know. So,
but it's always going to be the case, because if it was true then, and
mhm,
this is going out on a limb, whoever listens to this can agree,
mhm,
disagree, or think about it, or have thought about it. But even though that was the case then, that does not rule out, unfortunately, I'll put it on the line, because hey, we're talking, that's not the case now, or the
oh,
case in the future. Because if
or yeah,
those patriots back
mhm,
then said to this overwhelming, worldwide, imposing, and yet not imposing, because to them it was life, this
mm,
was theirs, just, if they could have said, you know what, no more. It's
yeah,
the equivalent of saying, nowadays, let's say everybody in Miami says, you know what, that those 10 toll booths that we have to go through every day, everybody says, no, no more,
yeah.
like this. So what happens then? They
Then it
can't do anything.
collapses. Then it
They
collapses.
can't,
You
right, they can't.
you have small examples of that having happened in today's life. Have you, for instance, and this is very, very small. This is nothing compared to what we're talking about. I'm
Yeah,
talking about breaking away from another nation and forming our own.
yeah.
This is a very, very small, but it still happened in modern times. You've heard of the wheel clamp
The
that
wheel
like
clamp.
towing companies used. You see a sign that says private parking, vehicles will be towed or what have you.
Is that the thing that goes under
It's
the
a
wheels?
big orange thing that clamps around the
Yes.
wheel
Yes.
that's locked on. And a
Okay. Yes.
towing company will put that on there and it doesn't come off unless you pay this amount.
Hmm.
I, in France, they tried to introduce those in France
Okay.
and people despised them. They hated them. So much so, for about 5 years, just about, I won't say everybody, but a majority of people were walking around with a tube of super glue in their pocket. And if they saw a clamp, they filled the lock full of super glue. So that even if the guy did pay, the clamp owner had to drill out the lock and basically destroy it to get it off the car. And they kept doing it and kept doing it and kept doing it. And finally, the towing companies decided it was too expensive to use them, and they stopped using them.
You know what I say to that without knowing the extra information of how bad the parking situation was or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's people deciding, no, not
Yeah.
here, not us.
Yeah.
Now, that wasn't passive resistance. That was malicious destruction.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think a single person was ever arrested for it, because secretly inside, the powers that be didn't like it either.
What do you mean?
Well, yeah, the person did break the law, but it seemed like you were holding somebody up. It was almost like a robbery, demanding money to release your vehicle. Just tow it to the yard and I'll go get it. Don't just clamp it there and hold me hostage on the street. That kind of thing. But the people rebelled. They said, no, we're not going to have that here. We hate it. And they destroyed so many of them. The towing companies just decided it was too expensive to keep using them, and they quit doing it.
That's an interesting, just.
Yeah, like I said, it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of life. There are no social ramifications to us over that thing.
But it's an example that's pretty.
It's an example that they thought it was egregious enough that they took a stand and said, no, you're not going to do that to us. No. And, I think it's great. But, back onto the founding of the country and that Old West and that pioneer spirit, it was denied a huge percentage of the country for so long, even after we became the USA.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until the end of the Civil War when that was corrected. I could never say cured, because I don't know that it ever was. But when that correction was made, and institutionally, legally, folks had, I won't say a completely equal protection, because that's subjective, but it was decided that freedom meant for everybody, not just us because we won and we deem ourselves superior, but for everybody here, that things started to mellow out. There's a lot of mellowing that still needs to be done.
It's a tough, that whole part of it,
Mm-hmm.
of that you're speaking of, that whole part of history and that moment, Civil War.
Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, you can't deny it. You can't wipe that out, because again, it's that sanitized version of history if you try to omit it.
That whole part of history, so here's the thing. So I don't know. So, if you were born back in the 1700s, let's say, or if you were born in any time in the past, with the customs of that time,
mm-hmm.
What things would we be more than willing to accept as normal, as opposed to where we are now? That's an unanswerable question, because there's examples of people in the past that fought for the civil rights of these people that were enslaved and treated, But I just want to say that from the vantage point of religion, Christianity, Judaism, for that matter, whatever, sort of the idea of looking at another human and saying that I have dominion over you. I don't think that you can honestly, conscientiously, and ethically, honest, be able to impose on that person your will. In other words, I don't know how to fix it in my mind, but a lot of people back then had to have had stirred conscience, because there's no way that I couldn't, it doesn't matter who, but this is in the context of me now. Who
Yeah.
knows me back then?
Yeah.
Who knows? Because we're liable to be totally different, more than likely. But how can you very much impose on another human being?
Well-
And at such outrageous, with such outrageous, how?
Again, we're applying a 21st century mentality to a 19th century and 18th century situation here. It's easy for us to say that, and it's easy for us to think that and genuinely mean that.
Right.
But that's not the way it was back then. We would be just as weird as we considered them. It's just as unthinkable for you and me to have this opinion to them back then as it is unthinkable for them to have that opinion.
And even back then, there were incredible examples of,
Yeah.
Europeans that
Mhm.
were like, and they died and fought and died back then, and said,
Yeah.
whoa, this
ain't right.
And they took up arms and were
Mhm.
followed, and they were
Mhm.
gunned down.
We went to war with ourselves over it. Brothers killed brothers. Fathers killed sons over it. The largest loss of U.S. life was fought over it. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a shocking thing, thinking in the context. And again, a lot of folks, if you're listening to this, you're interested. But I would suggest that the majority of people are not necessarily aware of the ground, or interested. Not that they couldn't be capable of grasping and digesting all, but just simply they prefer, let's say Justin Bieber and Selena Gomez playing "Ooh Baby Baby, Ooh 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 Baby Baby."
You got that album?
I have it, and it's
Okay, cool.
signed by both of them. I waited in line
Sweet.
10 hours and got the tickets.
Well, Jim Dockerel brings up a good point out here in the chat, live YouTube chat, by the way, Tuesdays, 9:30 Eastern, 6:30 Pacific on our YouTube channel.
That's right. And we also have a website, and it's trampledunderfootpodcast.com. And you can go there and check out our past episodes. We're talking about this topic today, and it might be I'm having a good time with it. It is a little bit on the edgier side of what we do, but we also go into a lot of things such as music, history, and different avenues, just going down the road. Questions about, I don't know,
life, the universe, and everything.
Exactly. So trampledunderfootpodcast.com, and if you press that Wayback Machine button, you could catch our past episodes.
That's right.
So Jim Dockerel was what?
Well, he brings up a good point. In the future, they will be saying the same thing about us. True. What will they be saying? Because we're looking at this with 240 odd years of hindsight. What would 240 years in the future, what would they be saying about us? Not just that our music was lame, and not just that, that was so cute how they did that stuff on the internet. You remember the internet? I remember the internet.
Yeah. Now it's just a chip in my brain, and I can,
But what would they be saying about us, our mentality, and our thought processes? I mean, because we think we are really advanced. We think we're so cool, and that everybody is so, we're developed to probably the highest level a human could develop themselves. And I think we all just know better than that. But
I'm going to throw this at you, and I'll see where you stand with this. But it's for me, using that example that you're, mentioning. For me, I believe in my life, the best form of being for me is to live my life as I so choose, within the confines of not hurting other people, respecting their persons, their property, respecting others, regardless of whether other people might think that's lame or this or that, or hey, but we got to take advantage, man, or look, that person is weak, so I have an inroad with that person, so let's take everything we can. all those concepts that may be good for all these psychopaths out there and these wretched souls. But for me, I think it's better, but that's my worldview, is to not aggress on with others. You can have debates, you can have ideological back and forth, but I do not want to hurt my neighbor. I do not want to place a hand on my neighbor. I do not want to take from my neighbor. I do not want any of that. But the catch is, I don't want that I want that as well for myself. So that's where I stand mentally. So I think that that's the safest way to proceed. And like you said, I could be dead wrong, but currently the way I see life, I think that that's the best way to live, in my opinion. What say you?
What a weirdo. I'm with you 100%.
Yeah.
You know? But then again, we're applying that 21st century. We're applying that 21st century mentality to it. I mean, and God knows where the 22nd century mentality is going to go.
But wait a second.
Because they're going to be the 22nd century. They'll be like, God, they were still talking about that stuff.
Oh, you mean they have it resolved by then?
Yeah, well, maybe, maybe not. Who knows? I don't know that it ever will be resolved. I really don't. I think that you are always going to have a certain percentage of any population, of any culture, of any people somewhere who are going to think that they are superior to another segment of society or another group of people. Somebody is always going to think that they are superior. And whether that be from an economic standpoint, an economic class system, or some sort of caste system, somebody is always going to feel superior to somebody else. So I don't know that it's ever going to be cured. But the more, I think, this is just my opinion, the further that is removed from the positions of power, the better for everybody.
Now, I'm in complete. Let me just say this. I'm in complete. Okay. That solution that you just gave was what I was thinking, and I'm sorry for cutting, but I just wanted to say that that's exactly, the further removed those positions are, the better and happier the grand majority. Yes. So continue. I'm sorry. I just wanted to agree with you on that.
Excuse me. Well, thank you. But the further removed those people are from the positions of power, the better off for everybody. Mm-hmm. But there's a difference in self-interest and selfish self-centeredness. If you are the president, prime minister, king, grand poobah, whatever, the leader of quote unquote your people, your focus has to be on your people, your nation. It has to be. You have to believe that what you do has to benefit the most within that city, state, county, country, whatever.
Yeah.
If you don't put them first, if you put other interests ahead of that, whether it be a different country, a different city, state, whatever, then you need to be out of that position of authority. You know, the president of the United States has to thank America first. The prime minister of Canada has to thank Canada first. The prime minister of the United Kingdom has to thank the UK first. The head of Germany, France, pick a country. They have to thank them first. If they don't, they got to get out. They got to get out.
No, yeah, it's basically if you had to break it down, I agree with you on that. And it doesn't mean that there can't be beautiful cooperation and a bunch of, but it's like the equivalent of saying that you have mom and dad and then 12 kids in your house, let's say, and and so mom and dad take the buckets of, like, I don't know, food and bread and wine and they travel across town and give it to Joe over there, and you have to feed your family.
True. That's
so
true.
Your kids don't wind up dead.
And that also doesn't mean an absence of competition, because competition is good for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everything from organized sports to more than one store on the same block.
Yes.
Competition causes people to strive to be better than the other guy, but better than this than themselves the day before. You know, competition benefits everybody. It really does, because not only are products, goods, services improved, prices are dropped because there is competition. And even if you think, well, it's not really competition because these two guys are in cahoots and they're going to price fix, who's to say there's not going to be a third guy to come in and undercut them both and say, oh, yeah, take this? Competition benefits everybody.
As long as there's not leverage by a higher
I was
power.
getting ready to say competition benefits everybody. You start putting insiders in there, that's not competition. You start introducing leverage, that's not competition. You know, so
It's a
yeah,
wonderful thing.
it's and that's why it was called, and it is still called, the Grand Experiment. Now, that doesn't have a whole heck of a lot to do with the Old West, other than to say every movie, every TV show, every radio show you saw or heard before Blazing Saddles was bovine scat.
See,
It was BS in capital letters.
well, and yet there's like, well, I like Bonanza
Well,
a lot.
never got into it.
Oh man,
I saw a few episodes, but I never really got into it.
with Little Joe, and
Mhm.
it felt like a warm. You can sit by the fire. We don't need that here in Miami, but in your imaginary fire in your head, and
Uh-huh.
just enjoy, the family, the Cartwrights together and adventures. I
Mhm.
loved it, man. It was so good. And again, just to, I guess, to round off the whole thing, I don't want to say the word, but it's like going to Disneyland and believing that you're a kid from the time you're there.
Mhm.
That good feeling of like, hey, this is a wonderful sort of like perfect world. It's that same. I would get that kind of vibe
Mhm.
from watching westerns and just that whole theme. And it's, I mean, it is what
Yeah.
it is.
I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's not good entertainment. I'm just saying that when growing up, the TV Western was not my thing.
You think we would have hated it if we were in the old west? We'd get to the home after a long day at the out on the prairie, and then you get home and like it's like lights out once the sun goes down, and like would you?
I don't think you would have hated it because I don't think you would have known any different. It's hard to hate something when it's the only thing you've known.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
but
mean,
if we if we had to go back and live in that, I mean,
oh yeah, knowing what we know now, sure. I mean, I don't even go camping anymore. I'd
could
like
you
to. I just haven't done it in a while. The army kind of took away my taste for living in a tent.
could you imagine how long your life would be extended if you lived back then in the context of, how when you have a lot of things to do, time goes by in the snap of a finger, and like your day's gone, the next day's gone, the week's gone, the year's gone. But back then, I'm just assuming here, but if you get home and there's like no, you hear crickets, you're like the time is ticking away if you have a clock.
But
And
you're
it's like, so your life in a way, it's like you live by 2 centuries at least.
but you're assuming they ever left home. There were a lot of people that lived their entire lives in one house and never left.
Inside the house,
Well, I mean, maybe they went outside to feed the chickens and gather eggs, but they never left the property.
the property itself, I hope
Yeah.
it was at least a few acres big.
You never know. I mean, we ran into this, and this is completely entirely off the subject. We ran into this when we were stationed in Hawaii. We lived in about the geographic center of the island of Oahu, and you could go up on the north. Let's see, it would be the northwestern shore, around the corner, about as far away from Honolulu as you can get, and stay on the same island. And we ran into people all the time that had never been to Honolulu, that had never been out of that town,
They've
never
never
out
been.
to the other side of the island. They didn't see any need to. They didn't need
Well,
to. They had a store here. They lived there. They
well,
made their money. They did their thing. They had no reason to go.
No, see, that's another thing also, and that gets into a whole thing. But okay, so I can totally understand that within the context of
Mhm.
it. Also all depends on what one a person's focus or
Mhm.
you know span of sort of interest and just a whole or need
And your
and all these.
ambitions.
But we could basically survive the rest of our lives in the same little area.
Sure. Well, you've been doing it for 40 how many years? So,
I mean, I have left.
you don't know. I'm not saying that. I know you did. You did go do a little bit of exploring anyway.
Well,
But
no, I've been to New York, I've been
Mhm.
to
Well, that's what I mean.
Chicago, I've
That
been all up and down, but I haven't stayed in those places, you
right.
know? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
I think that a lot of Americans do a lot of traveling, and I think that there's a lot of Americans that don't do much traveling at all,
That's
you know?
subjective too. That is subjective too. America gets a bad rap. Why don't Americans have passports? Well, because most of us don't need them. Why don't Americans travel? Well, who's to say that they don't? I mean, yeah, everything's relative, and you have to put it into context. The people who say, why don't Americans have passports, are mainly from Europe, where to go more than 500 miles, you have to have a passport because you're going into another country.
Well, with the European Union, they can cross, and whatnot.
Okay. Now, yeah. But to them, if you left Miami and came out here to visit me in Oregon, that's
It take a
roughly going
week,
to be
week,
that's going to be roughly 2,600 miles.
yeah,
You take somebody who lives in London and you send them on a 2,600-mile trip, they're in Moscow
yeah,
or they're somewhere in Central Europe or Eastern Europe,
or in the ocean.
you know? Or yeah, if they made that wrong turn at Albuquerque,
Yeah.
or down in Africa somewhere, it's so scale and context are, a lot of folks just don't realize how massive this continent is. It's pretty ding dong big. And because of the Mercator projection, you may or may it may or may not look as big as it is, but it's pretty ding dong big. And so when folks hear travel, you're talking about going from Seattle, Washington to Las Vegas, which is a long haul. It's a 2-day trip, unless you're one of those people that drink 42,000 cups of coffee and don't mind driving 18 hours in one day. It's a
That
long
alone,
it's a long trip.
yeah,
Yeah,
that alone is a tremendous.
right. Driving from Mexican border, from the California Mexico border on Interstate 5 to just about, maybe 30, 40 miles north of us, of my house right now, is the same as driving from Land's End in the UK to John O'Groats in Scotland. And that's one state. You still have half of another state and then another state before you get to the Canadian border. I mean, and that's just the 3 Western states. You got 47 more, you know?
Yeah, and not to mention with all that we've talked about variations regionally,
Mhm.
the different
Right.
things that you might see, and
Mhm.
it's like a whole continent of it. Not really, but yes, it is in a
It
way.
is. It's completely different. The Southeast is completely different from the Southwest, which is completely different from the Northwest, which is completely different from the Midwest, which is completely different from New England. I mean, we can go on,
Yeah.
you
So
know?
there's a lot of variations and all that,
Mhm.
but distances are pretty savage,
Yeah,
I must say.
there are. They are.
I
There
mean,
are there are places in Nevada. I've mentioned it before. Highway 50 was called the loneliest highway in America, where you can literally be the only car on the road, not pass another car, not see another vehicle for 2, 3, 4 hours. And because you're the only one there, you know, it's wide open. The distances are crazy. So when you say, well, Americans don't travel, sure we do. We just go within our nation.
which is plenty big.
Yeah. Most of the population of the U.S. has never been outside of the U.S., and they have no desire to do so.
I've been to Mexico.
Yeah, well, I have too. I've been to Canada as well, and Germany, France, Austria. Oh, let's see, Belgium.
And by the way,
Netherlands.
and by the way, talking about the Old West, last thing I'll say,
Mhm.
when I went to Mexico, I had that impression of old Western, but the cliffs and like mountains and stuff, which for a Floridian,
Mhm.
that's as different as like being on the moon. Um, Imagine this is all flat. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
But but I thought to myself, how did people back then, looking at that because you'd be driving and there's like a cliff right there, and like it goes way down, and you're like, but you're and it's desert like, and it's weird. And I'm thinking, how did people back then decide to jump from one place to the other, up and down mountains and this? It had to be insane. It
Yeah.
had to be insane, dude.
They didn't know what they were. They didn't know what they were going to find over the next hill.
I mean,
It,
it's like,
yeah.
oh, let's go to Tenesita's house way over yonder, and
Mhm.
just, okay, do you have the meal ready? And it's like a 10-day trip. It's just it because even by vehicle, you're like, holy smokes, man, you're so it was a very shocking thing in that respect. Beautiful.
Did you visit the Grand Canyon?
You know what? I drove by it. I could have made a turn. I said, I can make a turn. I said, no, I want to get to California.
Oh, okay.
And I just kept going. And I didn't stop at the hillside or encrusted in the mountain
Oh,
Pueblo.
yeah,
I didn't do that either because I said, no, I got to get to California. My
yeah,
mind was, I got to get to California.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That's something I've never seen either. But
yeah.
from what I understand, once you see it, it just changes your life. I don't know.
Really? That
Yeah,
much?
yeah.
It changes your life.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's well, when you think about because you were talking about the cliffs and all this, that, and the other, and that's what made me think of it. You realize just how small and insignificant one person can be when you see something like that. That kind of a landscape, that kind of a vista.
There's so many, Mark, there's so many questions.
Hmm.
It's the wonderful thing is that every little turn, there's a brand new series of questions and mysteries. I am motivated by that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
That's my sort of like thing.
Yeah.
I don't know about other people. I'm sure there's many like me, but I'm totally motivated with the mystery of what's next, or the brand new idea, the strange putting together of the history of a thing. You know, it makes things worthwhile to me.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I can't. I'm going to throw this out. I can't imagine, just sitting there and like, I don't want to know anything other than what I've got in my brain already. Let's
Yeah.
repeat that VHS tape and watch the same darn. I can't. It's just not me. I can't see
Some
how.
people don't crave intellectual stimulation, and these are the people who thought your cousin lived in Spain, Mexico.
Oh yeah.
Call back.
I think that we could leave it at that. I think that that's a
I
good
think
place.
we can too. We kind of got a little close to some sensitive subjects there. No disrespect meant to anybody. I don't know that any problems are
No, I think
caused or cured, but we
I mean
just
we.
uh, we just need to remember that people are people, man. That's
I believe that truly. That's my main thing. I am no better than. Look, in my belief system. See, let's throw the trifecta in. In my
okay.
beliefs, I'm going to throw the trifecta. Here's the
Okay.
trifecta. In my belief system, for better or worse, I do believe it's inconceivable for me that all this occurred out of nothingness. This is another topic, but I do believe in a creator created us and everything. And if that's the case, which I believe, and even if it weren't, I'm still a human being. You're still a human being, and why would I want to overtake or even be, you know, or over control or try to be above the next? So I have that belief. So people are people. I agree with you, and I just wanted to throw in the trifecta since this is
All right.
uh, an
Well,
episode of.
maybe next week we'll lighten it up and talk about how Jimi Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan were related.
Yeah, well, we could do that.
And it's my edit, so I'm going to have fun with this one.
Oh, this is a crazy one. Listen, I'll say that we had. Well, I'm not gonna say that. We have good times, and we go down different paths and stuff. And this was an interesting topic we've never really touched on. So I'm actually more stimulated by this kind of conversation when we do things that are a little bit more daring. So
Yeah, well, it was daring but kind of lame at the same time. But thank you for hanging around with us for this great grand social experiment we call the Trampled Underfoot Podcast. Remember, we're here Tuesday nights at 6:30 Pacific, 9:30 Eastern here on the mighty YouTubes. Look for us on YouTube, Trampled Underfoot Podcast. Hit that subscribe button, ring that little bell, then you'll be notified the next time we go live.
all right, catch you
Have a good
guys
one,
next
y'all.
time. A little lame as well.
A little lame as well.